I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is the author of two novels, no other than Mr. Douglas Weissman.
Hi, it's great to see you again. Nice sunny days for both of us.
Yes, sunny day, springtime, people. So, Mr. Douglas, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Douglas Weissman. I'm the author of Girl in the Ashes, which is a historical fiction that focused on a serial killer in occupied Paris during World War II. But I'm also the author of Life Between Seconds, which came out in 2022, the end of 2022, and is a bit different, a little twist on different themes, and all about character relationships and the beauty of friendship.
The beauty of friendship, people. So, Mr. Dog, how do you approach character development on both of your novels?
Absolutely. Well, I'm of the belief that if you don't have character, you don't have anything really. So it's about digging deep into the specificity of each character, what makes them a person as opposed to a character, how would they act in real life, how would they act in any given situation. Also, I'm one of those people who, or one of those writers that starts with a person in mind. For example, in my first novel, Life Between Seconds, Sofia, who is a 74-year-old Argentinian woman, very similar in temperament to my grandmothers. They were kind of, one was soft spoken but a really good cook, and the other one was a loud, direct New York woman who grew up in a Jewish family during the Depression. So they had very different experiences they were pulling from, but at the same time, that this is someone that I could base knowledge off of to build a completely new but knowable person.
Interesting novels, Mr. Dog's Girl in the Ashes. Let's do the recap of what we talked about last episode.
Absolutely. Girl in the Ashes, as I mentioned earlier, it focuses on Odette, who is a serial killer in World War II Paris, occupied by the Germans. And it's really about her journey, both leading up to whether she is going to have or wage personal battles to protect the ones she loves, or whether she's going to hide while the ones that she loves have their own secrets that could get her killed.
Interesting, people, soon to be available this coming April, right?
Yeah, April 16th is the release date of 2024. Just in case you listen later on, it'll already be released.
Yes, people. So, Mr. Doug, how has the publishing process for you?
Well, for me, I have come to the publishing process a little different than most. I didn't self publish, but I also didn't go through an agent. I was rejected by many agents on my first novel, over 175. So I decided that while I'm going to continue querying agents, I was also going to query smaller presses because Life Between Seconds was a quieter book. It had less plot, still plot, but less plot, less overt plot. It was a lot of building of relationships, what happens when those relationships break down, as opposed to something as dramatic and sexy as a serial killer, right? Because people love true crime. So I went to small presses that would look at that type of work and look at more on the beautiful sentences, the sentence structure, the voice, and those areas, along with a quieter plot. And I found a great publisher, Addison and Highsmith, that really liked the work and really liked the story. It was a very quick and easy process in terms of querying them accepting. The editing process was just 2 rounds, and then we moved right through it. And then came the marketing machine of trying to just get out there and let as many people know about it as possible. Girl in the Ashes, I admit, Girl in the Ashes, I was far less patient in terms of querying agents to get it out there. And although it's definitely a more commercial book, I still had reservations about going directly to agents when I had such a great experience with a small press and kind of doing my own marketing and PR. So I just directly went to small presses again to see who would be interested in this type of book. And I found Between the Lines, which are the ones who published Girl in the Ashes. And it was a similar, beautiful process. They were asking me a few questions, made sure my intentions were there, not just about the publishing process, but about the writing, right? What was my intentionality with certain choices that I made along the way? And then did those translate to commercial viability? And maybe those changed during, and there were a few things that changed during the editing process with that in mind as well. But overall, it was really great, but I wouldn't say it was traditional.
So, what's the most rewarding aspect of being an author?
Seeing your work out in the world and knowing that people beyond just your family and friends are reading it, I think is such a rewarding experience. It's one of those things for me at least that wanting to tell stories, wanting to share stories is about making emotional impact. And if people are reading my stories, they're going to get that emotionality that I'm putting into it. It's not about it's not about making money. Not every author. There are far more authors who are not Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or Dean Koontz, right? And it's not about making millions or billions. It's about being incapable of keeping these stories to myself and needing to get them out into the world for people to read and to make a connection with them just based on the fact that I wrote it, they picked it up and read through it.
Yes. Very well said, Mr. Doug. So, if you go back and give advice to yourself when you were first starting out as a writer, what would it be?
Nothing, because I wouldn't have listened. That's that's I know myself well enough. I've made every single mistake a writer could make in terms of writing too generally, thinking that that's how people make connection, when really it's about specificity that people connect with. Or I've made the mistake of querying multiple agents at the same time in the same email and them easily discovering that going the easy route and not getting their attention that way. I've made the mistake of mistaking actually what interiority is versus what showing and telling is, right? Thinking interiority of a character is the same as telling when it's really not. That's part of the emotional landscape and getting that emotional connection that you need to connect with a character. So I would have tried to go back and explain something to myself back then, even something as don't worry about rejections. Rejections are part of the process, or take your time, slow down, and focus. Read deeply the stories that you love, and figure out what those authors did to get you to love those stories or those characters or those moments. I would have said maybe all of those things, maybe one of those things, and I still at that time probably would have said, yeah, whatever.
Yes, whatever, people. But we need connections. Connection, people. But before we go on, Mr. Doug, I want to shout out my ranking tops in the last 30 days because in Bolivia, I got number 2 on the Apple chart, Pakistan at number 8, Nigeria at number 12, United Arab Emirates at 16, Bhutan at 24, Jamaica at 61, Japan at 74, Cameroon at 81, Egypt at 88, Thailand at 118, Cambodia at 156, and a lot more. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world like Mr. Douglas Weissman. So, Mr. Doug, let's talk about your first novel.
Gladly. That novel is still a deep part of me because it took me 11 years to write and publish. And most writers, well, I can't say most writers, but many writers that I know do not end up publishing their first novel. They write their first novel, then they might put it in a drawer for a long time, write a second novel, and that's the one that gets published because their first novel kind of teaches them how to write in a way. I was far too stubborn to let my first novel go. And I just loved the characters too much and the story. And in it, you find Peter, who's about 25 years old, and he's American, and Sophia, who's 74 years old, and she's from Argentina. And they're both running away from their past traumas, but running towards a friendship with each other. However, when those traumas show up where they start to run away from each other. And they have to decide, are they going to stay, face their trauma, and let their friendship evolve, or are they going to continue running away?
Well, interesting, Mr. Doug. So, what is the writing process for this life between seconds?
Yeah, Life Between Seconds really taught me what my process is. And at the time, I was in grad school. I had traveled all over the world a few times. I'd lived in Italy for a year and traveled all over Europe. I'd done a year abroad and just traveled. I went east from California and just kept going east for a year until I wound up back in California. And then I also ended up doing about 5, 6 months in South America, where I met the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, whose story, that's Sofia is involved with them in her story in Life Between Seconds. And the women continue marching around the presidential plaza, holding signs, demanding to know what happened to their loved ones during the dirty war in Argentina. They hold up photos of their loved ones, their brothers, their fathers, their sons, even their sisters or their daughters at some point. And they just want to know, just understand, are they dead? Where are they? Maybe they were in jail. Maybe there's hope. And I was so moved by that when I got back to California, I went to University of San Francisco and their MFA program in creative writing, and I had to write this story. And through that process, I learned that I do not write linearly at all. I do not start with point A and I go to point B and point C and point D. I write with whatever thing I am interested in writing at that moment. It's not waiting for the muse, it's just forcing the muse to kind of rise up at that moment in whatever I'm going to write about. And I would write about them sitting in a restaurant, or Peter talking to a woman in an art museum, or something along these lines, as long as I got writing done that day. So when it came down to me actually having to put together what the plot of the novel was, I had all these disconnected scenes that I had to figure out what the structure is, what comes first, what comes second, what comes third. So I took index cards, different colors. Each one was a different color. I think it was green for Peter, white for Sophia, pink if they were in the same scene together, and then a couple other colors for other characters. And I put them all on my floor. I put down what the main theme of the chapter was, like what happened in this chapter, what's moving the plot along. Put them all on my floor, and then I just moved them around. And then I would say, oh, well, it looks like there are too many pink cards together, or there are too many green cards together, and I have to move this around a little bit more. And I thought, oh, maybe I'd go one Peter chapter, one Sophia chapter, one Peter chapter, one Sophia chapter. But it just didn't work that way. And I was able to figure out what structure works best for the story I'm trying to tell. And it didn't have to be linear. It didn't have to be consecutive. It didn't have to be a one, then one, then one, then one. It just had to be what felt emotionally true to these characters, what made sure that you didn't feel disconnected from one character for too long, and what moved the story forward and the emotional arc of the story forward the best.
Life between seconds. How did you come up with the title,
Oh, that's a good question, because I feel like it's the best
Mr.
title I'm
Doug?
ever gonna get. But it's the biggest thing for me with Life Between Seconds coming up with that title. I had a terrible working title, and I don't even want to mention it here because it made no sense, and it made no sense to what the story became. It made sense with the original concept of the story, but that concept was thrown out the window very early on. I just wasn't ready to write that kind of book, the original concept of the book. And then one day I'm writing in Sophia's point of view, and she says something along the lines of something about the pain in life between seconds. And I just was so taken aback by how poignant the thought was. I'm like, that's the title. That is the title that I have to have.
Interesting title, Mr. Dog. So, can you describe the main characters or themes in your book that readers can look forward to?
Absolutely. It's really about trauma and how people deal with their traumas differently. Peter is dealing, and I'd love to give a content warning right now, just in case we have any listeners who need it. But Peter's dealing with his mother's suicide, and he never really gets over that because of the way that it happens, because of how young he was. And so he's constantly running away from essentially her ghost that's chasing him throughout the rest of his life, while Sophia is running away from the loss of her child who was disappeared during the Dirty War. And that ghost chases her throughout her life. So Sophia kind of gives up on her marriage because of the pain of losing her child, and Peter gives up on a life because of the pain of losing his mother. But then they meet together in San Francisco and start forging a relationship based upon their mutual pain, even though they don't really share where that pain is coming from.
Yes, indeed. So, life between seconds, did you draw from any personal experiences when crafting the story or characters?
A bit of personal experience. Part of it was my travels and meeting people who have just dealt with this type of pain and loss in the past, especially when talking with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, learning more of their stories, researching more of what led to it, what happened during that time, but also being part of the Jewish community and having so many conversations with Holocaust survivors within my community when I was growing up, and the way that they would talk about loss and the way that they would talk about how they continue to move forward and the life choices they've made after those moments. And even in that, the intergenerational trauma of dealing with such an event within my Jewish community, with from my parents, from my grandparents, and my both my grandfathers were stationed in the Pacific arena during World War II, and so it just creates this tremendous ecosystem of love, but also loss and pain, and how do you deal with it moving forward, and the different ways that people either choose to or choose not to confront those moments and can run away from them. And then running away from it, what does that do to you or for you? One of the biggest things is that I always have to say, Peter is not like me. He is not me. He traveled. The biggest thing Peter took from me, or that I gave to Peter at the beginning, was a need to travel. And it was because it was the closest thing that I could understand at that time to get close to Peter, because Peter was far harder for me to write than Sophia. But once I drew a line between who Peter was and who I was, he actually became somebody far easier to write and connect with. And I know many, many writers, and this is true of whether they're friends of mine or they're historically great writers, who often wrote veiled biographies, or at least characters who were thinly veiled personas of the writer themselves. And Peter was not that for me. He may have started out that way, and then I quickly and eagerly was able to dissect him from.
Indeed, interesting, Mr. Dog. And according to Deborah Harbeck, felt for these characters. So, what are the elements that you put in your story that once you read it, you will felt it?
It's really about getting as close to these characters as you can to make it a bit claustrophobic. And that's the way that I used to describe it when I was trying to share it with my writing groups or share it with friends to try and explain what it is. I wanted you to be so deeply involved with these characters that it made it hard to breathe, in a way that you could feel what they felt. You would smell what they smelled. You couldn't escape San Francisco, let alone their apartment complex, and the places that they're living because you felt so lived in this story with them. And I think that it has made all the difference.
Yes, definitely. But before we go on, Mr. Doug, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the five-star restaurant in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about one of the supreme sauce in the Italian cuisine called pesto sauce. Plus one more. Our books are out, not only one, but 13 volumes, people. Food 101, Volume 1, Basics. Until 13 is only the books that you need. How to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Mr. Dog Life Between Seconds, can you share a memorable moments that you encounter when you're writing this amazing book, amazing novel?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to think of a moment I had when writing the book necessarily. Actually, here's one. It's more of the writer side of things, but I was in a cafe, this place, I think it was called Ritual, which I don't know if it's still there or not, but it was very popular at the time when I was living in San Francisco in the Mission District. And it was a place where if you did not get there by about 8:30 in the morning, all the tables were already filled with artists or writers or tech kids working from the coffee shop that day. And I was one of them. Well, not a tech kid, but a writer trying to find a space. Really good pastries, decent tea, because I drink tea, not coffee. Please don't at me for that. But I ran into one of my instructors who just came in for a coffee, who lived in the neighborhood. And I told him, he asked me what I was working on, what scene I was working on at the time. And I told him, I don't remember specifically now what that scene was, but I said this. I remember directly. I said, I'm going to write all of the scenes that interest me first, and then I'm going to fill in all the boring stuff later. That's what I said. And he looked at me and he said, Doug, why do you need any of the boring stuff? And that blew my mind. And I realized, yeah, I don't need any of the boring stuff. I don't have to put any boring stuff in here. Just keep the stuff that interests me. And for whatever reason, that was the first time that I ever thought that thought.
Yes. I just want to share about saying about boredom. So the boredom is the canvas upon which creativity paints the most vibrant colors. Uh, do you agree with that, Mr. Dog?
Oh, absolutely. I can't count the number of times where boredom has been the offspring of a great thought, where not allowing myself the ability to just sit and think hinders my ability to sit and think. And that's something as simple as not being able to sit and stare out the window for 5 minutes because I'm checking my phone or I'm checking my email or I'm getting pinged for something. And what I think the average person, don't quote me the exact number, but I'm paraphrasing it a bit, but I think the average person checks their phone about 250 times a day. And
Paranoid.
imagine if you weren't
Yes.
checking your phone for 250 times a day, how much time you'd have to sit and think or to read or to do art or something. And I'm not exempt from that either. I do check my phone too much for my liking. I like to think that I'm better just because I'm aware of it, but at the same time, it doesn't mean I'm not checking. I'm still checking my phone, which is unfortunate.
Yes, everybody does. Just like cell phone is our lives.
Yeah, right?
We are not complete without them.
Yeah,
So,
I'm
Mr.
so
Doug,
ready.
what do you hope
I was
readers?
just thrown away.
Yes. So, life between seconds. What do you hope readers will take away from your book after they finish reading it?
Hope. I would love for readers to just feel hopeful after they finish reading it. Just hope that things get better. Hope that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That trauma, one of the biggest misconceptions about trauma, I think, is that you get better in a way. To say it crudely, you get better when really it just gets easier, but it doesn't mean that you get better. The trauma, the pain of that trauma is always there. It's just that we learn to handle it, or it gets just a little easier to understand where it's coming from, or it gets easier to wake up and go to work that day, as opposed to how overwhelming it can be at times. And I
Yes.
want people who read it to know that there's hope there in whatever way you need it. There's hope.
Yes. Hope, 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 people. So, life between seconds. Is there any particular authors or books that influence your writing style?
Absolutely. I would say that the first author who's a poet that just really blew my mind, and I wanted to emulate them in a way within fiction, was Aaron Shurin, Shurin. He was an instructor in San Francisco, and he came to speak in one of my classes once. And I don't remember exactly what poem it was, but it was from, at the time, his newly released book of poems called Citizen. And I just remember seeing an ellipses followed by an exclamation mark. So it was a dot, 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 exclamation mark. And I was like, what does that even mean? And I asked him, because he was there, I was able to ask him after reading this poem. And he said, well, it's as if the thought trails off, or the sentence, the words trail off, but the meaning just hits you in the face. And that is exactly what happened when I read that, and so it stuck. And I thought it was the first time I really understood that I could play with punctuation, or I could play with the length of a sentence, and really have that work towards how someone's feeling while reading the story. And so I really love that frenetic aspect, the idea that if I do a run-on sentence, it's there for a reason, and it's supposed to force the reader to keep pace. If I do really staccato sentences, it's supposed to kind of imitate the heartbeat. Whatever reason it is, I'm doing it to affect the reader, whether the reader knows it or not, right? Because it's not just about the words, it's about the length of the sentence and how that reads and and sounds to them as they're doing it. And then whenever I would get stuck and I wouldn't be able to write, writer's block, whatever you want to call it, I would type out the first paragraph of A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, and I would just type it over and over, just the first paragraph over and over, until I was able to move forward from that into whatever scene I needed to write that day. And I think that it had a pretty profound effect on the book and the rhythm of the book. But then at the same time, I can't deny I was reading Jose Saramago, who wrote Blindness, was one of the ones that I was reading at that time. And I don't know if he's famous for many things, but one of the things I know him for is run-on sentences, no paragraph breaks, no chapter breaks. You're lucky if you could find a period on a page. And
Yes.
it just creates this sense of, disillusionment. You just don't even know, trying to figure out where you are within those stories, because of the intentional way that he leaves these things out, is incredible to me. And it really creates a sense of chaos within a book, especially that book, that is thematically chaotic. And I loved it. And so I even had to take that, and I wrote one of my favorite chapters in Life Between Seconds is the moment where we learn what happens to Sophia's daughter, but it's 2 pages. It's 2 pages, but it's only 2 sentences long. So over the whole 2 pages, you only get 2 periods. And so it has that. There are run-on sentences. You're just moving forward. I tried to read it at a reading once, and I emphasized try, because I especially tried to do it with one breath. It didn't. It did not. I almost passed out.
So, Mr. Doug, life between seconds, how important was research in creating the world or context of the book?
It was paramount. I only knew so much about the dirty war in Argentina and the history of Argentina. And while traveling around, I learned so much and gained so much. And when talking to members of the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, I was able to gather so much information, but it still was incomplete. And I needed more, not just context to their lives, but context leading up to those moments that led to that, context from after that moment and where the country ended up. And then also in terms of Peter's life and moments of San Francisco, because I was living in San Francisco in 2011 to 2014, but the book was taking place at the turn of the 2000s. And so what has changed in San Francisco? What hasn't changed in San Francisco? What was San Francisco like in the 1990s, especially as the neighborhoods were so different and transitioning at the early 2000s, just like it was in the 2010s. So research was super important, but I also learned at that time that too much research meant procrastinating.
I agree. I agree. Very well said, Mr. Doug. So, how do you see your two novels fitting into a broader literary landscape or cultural conventions?
I would love if Life Between Seconds 10 years from now was still being talked about. The book is a slow burn, and so I would love if it slowly gained more notoriety and in 10 years from now it sticks around as opposed to a New York Times bestseller that you forget about in 10 years. I'm not naming any names, I'm just using that as an example. It's just that idea of being associated with a piece of work that transcends time. And I hope similarly that Girl in the Ashes makes a big splash now, but resonates far deeper than just a flash in the pan murder book because of the different themes that it's talking towards, the different themes that it's representing, and the fact that it is talking about much more than just a serial killer at an opportune time in history.
Yes, and I hope Girl in the Ashes will be the next footprints of Silence of the Lamb. It will be echoes to generations to come because probably it will become a movie, a series, or whatever that make our society make this book well known. So, Mr. Dog, can you please invite our listeners to support all your two novels?
Absolutely. I would love you to support these two novels and find what you're looking for within them. Life Between Seconds is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You could find it at Target. It's actually available wherever books are sold. Then Girl in the Ashes is available Barnes and Noble directly from the distributor, Between the Lines Publishing. You could also find it on Amazon, bookshop.org. These are great places to buy your books. And also, you can find me and support me as an author and be part of the conversation of writing and literary merit and whatever else you'd like to talk about on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. I'm very open, love to talk writing, love to talk books, and I'd love to hear more opinions about all sorts of writing styles and types.
Yes, people support Mr. Douglas Weissman because if you support him, more books to come. So, Mr. Doug, in celebration of Poetry Month next month, I'm inviting you to come back and let's read your favorite poetry, your
Oh, thank
favorite
you.
poems.
I would love that. I have actually, you can't see it. I have a bookcase off to my left that has about four massive volumes of poetry because one of my favorite things is that poetic license is something I love to put in my books that editors always flag because they're, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Like, well, if it works in poetry, why does it not work in fiction? I'm not saying the bowl is talking. I'm referencing that the bowl looks like it's talking because somebody's talking behind the bowl. Let's figure this out.
Yes. Tune in, people. Next week, we gonna read poetry in celebration for Poetry Month. So, Mr. Douglas, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I always love being here. I hope everybody loves listening because it's a really good time.
More to come, people. See you soon.